Good morning, Andre. Always good to see you.
Good morning. How's everyone? Look at all that black wealth. Jesus.
Well, that's what we're here to talk about.
That's right.
So let's start with the good news. The recently released data from the Federal Reserve notes that in just 3 years, specifically 2019 to 2022, that we actually were able to decrease the black-white wealth gap ratio from 1:8 to 1:6. Talk a little bit about that progress.
Well, let's first talk about ratios. I don't want to take you back to math, but you know there's a numerator and a denominator. And when we measure the black-white wealth gap, we put the black median wealth as the numerator and white wealth as the denominator. And that is getting smaller, largely because that numerator, that top number, black wealth is increasing, right? And that's largely coming from housing equity. Most of the wealth that is in black communities is driven by housing equity. Second is business equity. And it's different from white and Asian groups in that stock equity is much lower for black Americans. But because the housing market has been robust, you see increases in black wealth. So that numerator is increasing at a much faster rate. Black wealth essentially went from 28,000 from 3 years ago to 45,000. So there's been a 60% increase in median black wealth.
You mentioned housing equity being a driver. Can you just define net housing equity for everybody and just how that impacts wealth?
Yeah, and I talk about housing equity a lot. We know
Panel.
that's it. And on the next panel, we'll talk about it a little bit too. But your homes are worth a significant portion of your wealth. So it accrues wealth over time. There's value on the home. There's value in the land. We assess that value both through taxation and through appraising. And it's been in America the most common way to build wealth over time. Certainly, there's been factors over the course of our history that denied us that housing equity. But over the last few years, we've actually seen a small increase in home ownership. We're starting to correct for the valuation efforts, and you're starting to see growth in wealth overall as a result. And just understand what housing equity does. When you think about housing equity, that's the money people use to start a business. That's the money people use to send their kids to college. It's the money people use to get IVF treatments. If you want to run for office, you draw the equity down from from your home. So it is a lifeline for many people. It's the money that people use to climb economic ladders. So it's very important. And it also describes overall community wealth. When you have higher home ownership rates, you have higher longevity. It is one of the biggest factors on whether or not we live longer. And it's not just about shelter. It's about all the other predictors that come along with it.
And when you look at the data, it shows that basically every dollar metric for wealth has increased. In fact, for all races.
Yeah, all races.
But we also know that the gap has also increased. Can you just speak to that, Dalila?
Yeah, black wealth is increasing, but the gap, there is still a gap when you look at all the value of equity across the different asset classes. So stocks, homes, businesses, income, all that's increasing for white people at a higher rate because they're concentrated in stock equity and higher rates of business equity. So part of this, the goal over the next next decades is to increase asset classes. Derek Hamilton's going to speak a little bit later on today. We need new forms to draw down on wealth. We need to increase the share of employer firms. Ty Boye Robinson here of CapEQ 1555, that's their goal. We need to build upon the work being done in housing. And if we can do those things, we can narrow the wealth gap even further.
So the pie is bigger.
The pie is, and that's what, when you think of ratio, understand that it's not just a comparison of black wealth to white wealth. That when you look at wealth overall, the pie is growing. It's growing, and our share is just not growing as fast as other groups. So you can have black wealth increasing, but at the same time widening the gap. And it goes without saying that a lot of that is because of discrimination. If not for that discrimination, we would see a much a tighter wealth comparison.
But even with systemic bias and discrimination, we've made gains.
Absolutely.
In this specific time frame that the study covers, and one of those is through entrepreneurship, the business equity piece you just mentioned. In fact, many of us were in Atlanta last week talking about the Center for Black Entrepreneurship, which we're an investor in because of BEA, because it's important. Can you talk about what the data shows us about Black business ownership? I mean, there's some promising trends in this area in particular.
Yeah, overall, in terms of sole proprietorships, right, Black people are on par with our counterparts, whites, Latinos, Asians, generally a little bit higher than the average population. It's in the employer firm realm. So firms with more than one employee, and I mentioned CAP EQ and the Path to 1555, that effort to increase the share of the black employer firms to match the Black population. Currently, the Black population is about 14%, but we only have 2% of employer firms. If you increase the share of employer firms to match the Black population, you would add 800,000 more firms in the economy, trillions added, millions of employees added to the economy. It would be a game changer. Now, why this is important, during this pandemic, you saw an increase in employer firms in Black communities. And so much of the good news around this is there's been so many myths and false narratives about what Black people can and cannot do with money. During this pandemic, we've seen tremendous government subsidy poured into the economy. We've seen a tremendous amount of philanthropy, and a number of other sources of revenue. And what happened during that period? More businesses were founded in Black communities than any other community, right? And it tells you, when resourced, we're going to start firms. And what we're seeing, the evidence is showing that these firms are sustaining themselves. So they're starting to hire employees. Certainly, we want to see these firms grow from 5 employees to 10 to 500 to 5,000. Because when you're seeing that kind of growth, you're really in those sectors that we need to get in. Certain utility firms, certain tech sectors. We need to start to go in that direction. But the narrative that we don't know how to run businesses, I'll just share real quick. We did a study, and I love this study. We scraped all the Yelp data from businesses all across the United States. And we got the race of the owner, we got the revenue. And what we found is that Black, brown, and Asian-owned firms actually score higher in Yelp than our white counterparts. But we get less revenue in Black neighborhoods. And so the perception of the neighborhood is influencing the perception of the business. Now, that's problematic because you're forcing high-quality businesses to then compete with low-quality businesses. You're getting less equity in those neighborhoods. But one thing I always say that the elders were absolutely correct. Our ice is just as cold. Our ice is just as cold. This is about investing in Black businesses. We're the underappreciated asset, meaning if you add water, it will grow. So it's important that we have focused metrics around increasing employer firms, focused metrics on making sure we increase in certain sectors, but we know how to start businesses. And let's be clear. There's a lot of conversation about founding businesses, starting businesses. We need to talk about acquiring, purchasing businesses, merging businesses, so we can scale up to those numbers that we need. But what is clear, there's entrepreneurial spirit. Oh, I'll mention one other study. I know I'm like going, but we're about to release a study where we examine the attributes that it predict for entrepreneurialism. So we looked at all the psychological factors that predict for somebody to become a business owner. This will be released in the next couple of weeks on the Brookings platform. And what we found is that Black communities have more of those attributes than other groups. So this is not a matter of, do we have the makeup or do we have the willingness? It's about capital. We need to get the capital. And when we do, you're going to see growth in those areas.
Which I do think is one of the more important foundings, just sort of the data, and just to really help us think about how do we invest going forward, right? We know that Black founders support Black communities, hire Black people, and that has a wealth factor, that has a multiple. You also took a look at the data in terms of the liquid assets and income. So talk about that. And you mentioned government subsidies, because that played a role in these few years.
Yeah, during this 3 years, we actually saw a decline in liquid assets. So income from various sources, a traditional income, but you could draw income from retirement and other sources. But that drop was largely a result from massive unemployment at the beginning of the pandemic. And during that 3 years, we saw a number of things happen. We saw ARPA dollars, we've seen CARES, we've seen a number of things. And that seemed to keep Black people afloat in the aggregate. And then towards the end of that 3-year period, you started to see growth in businesses. And again, we point to, in the aftermath of George Floyd, the philanthropy that was poured in, but it was, again, really basic government subsidy put into communities that then people use to start their firms. They were mostly micro firms, they were mostly sole proprietorships, but you're starting to see them grow. So the story there is the power of government can have an impact. And we need to keep pressure on government to provide the resources towards the businesses that will actually give the growth. This is not about a handout or anything else. I know there's a mixed group here, there's a political affiliation, but what is clear, if you give capital to the businesses that will provide the growth, you're actually going to give to Black businesses. So and we have the evidence of that. This 3 years was partly an experiment of sorts to see what would happen if we did release capital and you saw growth, particularly among the business community.
Yeah, the government subsidies work, right? In this very short time frame, we moved the needle on a number that, hasn't changed that much in 70 years.
That's right.
At the end of the day. Let's talk about stock holdings and stock equity. We know that there was a slight increase, but there clearly we have a lot of room and opportunity in this area.
Yeah, this is an area where you do see the biggest disparity among the asset classes who hold stock. That's also related to the jobs that we hold. Many people do not work in jobs where they're getting a 401k, and they're not getting that retirement saving. They're not they don't have that those stock options, and clearly that's a result of discrimination over time. That when you have discretionary income, you invest it more than likely, and so we've seen over time white people in the white community just have more discretionary resources to invest in the stock market, and you can have sizable gains in the stock market. And this is, again, I mentioned Derek Hamilton earlier, and I really believe in baby bonds in this regard, because whereas housing, you can actually do a lot of things in housing, and we'll probably talk about that in the next panel, to increase home ownership. The stock market's a different story. You're not going to take money out of people's stocks. You're not going to change it in any way. So you need new wealth drivers that gives everyone an opportunity to invest in themselves and others. So we're going to need new tools to build wealth. There's no way around that. And when you grow that wealth, then you'll be able to invest in other vehicles. And so for me, it is about being encouraged that we know that we can build wealth. We know that we can build businesses. We know that we can own homes. It's about figuring out ways to get that equity pumped into our communities and just let nature take its course.
And I mean, it's a good point, because on the stock equity side, it's also about intergenerational wealth.
That's right.
Right? You have that discretionary income, or those dollars that can stay invested when you're able to build wealth over time. And because we do know, right, this was a big driver for white wealth in that time period.
You know, there's a lot of narrative around that about, you know, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and you know, working hard. But the wealth gap that we see today is really a result of Black people being denied wealth. I mean, slavery, of course, Jim Crow racism, housing discrimination. That's the gap. And so, but it is not about wherewithal, innovation, all these other things. We are doing it, but wealth begets wealth. And so when you see that pie grow, it's really because we have generations of people that were allowed to get that wealth and they transferred to their children. You know, interesting study by the Fed, they saw that when white students graduate from college, they're much more likely to get an intergenerational wealth transfer. When Black people graduate from college, we got to give our families money. I'll never forget that. I'm bitter about
payroll now.
That's exactly. I'll never forget. I graduated from college.
Still pay a cell phone bill, though.
Exactly.
I see you out there.
But man, my auntie said, "Andre, you graduated from college. You got to help fix the roof." I'm like, how does that work? You know, I mean, but that is part of the burden that comes from not having wealth. And so it is important, particularly in conferences like this, to figure out ways to drive equity. I certainly believe in debt capital and other forms of capital, but we got to drive equity. We got to restore the value that's been extracted by racism. There's no way around it. And the smart minds in this room, the smart minds across America, and the wherewithal in Black communities, that will get it done. But it starts with recognizing that, we can grow wealth. Let's continue to get the equity in our community.
So I want to leave this conversation, and put some solutions on the table. That's why all of us are here. That's what the agenda is about. What are, those solutions that will bring hope to this issue? So we have the intergenerational. We're not going to close the wealth gap overnight. We have, long-term gaps in savings, investments, but we still found out in 3 years we were able to move that number. So given the multiple sectors we have in the room today, I know we think about it a lot in terms of our commitment to digital equity and economic mobility. Just the power, again, of the cross-sector group here today. What are some of those key solutions you want people to
in general, there's a framework I use, but there's some specifics. I really do believe you have to invest in people first and foremost. Cut the check for entrepreneurs, cut the check for future homeowners, for current homeowners whose homes have been devalued. you've got to figure out a way to get capital to people. The second point is you have to invest in place. Wealth is also concentrated in place. And so if you only invest in brick and mortar in sort of the physical structures of community, the value of things will rise up and people won't keep pace. So you always got to invest in people and then invest in place. But you also have to divest from racism. There are still systems that extract wealth and opportunity without anyone wearing a white hood, without anyone with a tiki torch. But these are everyday practices that this extract wealth and opportunity. And so for me, if you do that, but obviously we got to increase home ownership. We'll may talk about expanding special purpose credit programs. I really do. I say this. I said this about 2-3 times now. We have to be focused on increasing the share of employer firms in particular sectors. We know how to do these beauty salon service work. And we're highly concentrated in transportation, service, waste management. There are a lot of other sectors we got to be focused on. And then finally, it's really about narrative shift. I've talked a lot about narrative. We got to move away from this narrative that we're not able, because I say, like, it keeps my teeth white, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. And I say that to say we need to focus on the structures. With that said, there is a dominant narrative out there that says we can't do. And it defies everything that we've done to this point, but particularly now where you're seeing growth. We gotta trumpet that word, that growth, because we're proving it. We're proving it every day. So.
Yeah, and not only can Black people the data proves out we can do it with a lot less.
That's exactly right.
We shouldn't have to.
That's right.
But you can imagine what that multiple looks like when we're investing, right, in Black people, Black founders. So,
sure.
Andre, as always, thank you for your insights on the data. Looking forward to the next panel, and hopefully all of you took away some real meaningful opportunities about how we think about what we're advocating for going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.